On the evening of April 15th, 1814, the Marchioness of Harcourt's spring ball blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing in crystal chandeliers and casting golden warmth across the silk-papered walls of the grand ballroom. Eleanor Ashworth stood near the refreshment table, positioned in that particular shadow between two towering arrangements of white roses where she had learned through 6 seasons of practice that she might observe without being observed, might exist without being noticed, might breathe without drawing the cutting attention of those who found her very presence an affront to their delicate sensibilities. The unseasonably warm spring evening had prompted the footman to open several windows, allowing a jasmine-scented breeze to drift through the crowded room and mingle with the heavier perfumes of the assembled company. Yet Eleanor felt no relief from the oppressive weight that had settled upon her chest the moment their carriage had arrived. Her deep blue silk gown, chosen by her mother with the explicit intention of minimizing what Lady Harriet Ashworth delicately termed her daughter's more generous proportions, rustled softly as Eleanor shifted her weight, watching her younger sister Clara float across the dance floor in the arms of yet another enchanted partner. Clara, wrapped in pale pink muslin that accentuated her dainty figure and porcelain complexion, laughed at something her partner whispered, the sound carrying across the room like silver bells, and Eleanor felt the familiar ache beneath her ribs that she had long ago learned to identify not as jealousy, but as a kind of resigned grief for possibilities she had been foolish enough to entertain in her youth. At 27, Eleanor had accepted her position in the world with the quiet dignity of a woman who had spent too many seasons pressed against ballroom walls, too many afternoons watching callers arrive for her sister while she sat with her needlework, too many nights lying awake in her chamber wondering what flaw in her character had led Providence to house her spirit in a form that society found so thoroughly unacceptable. She was too tall, they whispered, standing nearly as high as most gentlemen of her acquaintance. Too wide, they murmured behind their fans, as though her curves were a personal insult to the current fashion for willowy figures. Too old, they declared with pitying glances, as though 27 were an age beyond redemption, rather than the mere beginning of a life she might have lived differently had circumstance been kinder. The orchestra struck up another waltz, and Eleanor watched Clara accept a new partner, her dance card evidently as full as Eleanor's was empty, and she reached for a glass of lemonade simply to give her hand something to do when she heard it. That particular whisper pitched just loud enough to be overheard, just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. I cannot imagine what Lady Harriet was thinking, bringing the elder daughter again, came the voice, dripping with honeyed malice. One can only wonder if the floors have been reinforced to bear such a burden. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, though she had trained herself through years of such comments to absorb the impact without visible reaction, to let her face remain as smooth and untroubled as the surface of a still pond, even as beneath it her heart clenched with that familiar mixture of shame and weary resignation that had become as much a part of her as her too tall frame and too wide hips. She set down her glass of lemonade with careful precision, her fingers steady despite the trembling that had begun somewhere deep in her chest, and she did not turn to identify the speaker, though she recognized the voice as belonging to Lady Lydia Carstairs, that elegant viper whose tongue had drawn blood from more than one unfortunate soul during Eleanor's years navigating the treacherous waters of London society. Lady Lydia held court near the champagne, surrounded by her usual circle of admirers and sycophants, women whose laughter tinkled like broken glass as they dissected their fellow guests with surgical precision, and Eleanor knew without looking that she had become their evening's entertainment, a role she had filled at countless gatherings before this one. She heard another voice join the chorus, younger and higher, perhaps Lady Lydia's cousin Miss Whitmore, who had debuted this very season with all the advantages Eleanor had never possessed: a delicate frame, a modest fortune, and parents ambitious enough to display her properly. Such a pity about the elder Miss Ashworth, this new voice murmured with theatrical sympathy. One wonders if she even fits through standard doorways, or if the servants must widen them specially when she visits. The circle erupted in muffled laughter, the sound of fans raised to cover smirking mouths, and Eleanor focused her attention on the terrace doors that stood perhaps 20 feet away, calculating the steps required to reach them without appearing to flee, without granting these women the satisfaction of knowing their barbs had found their mark. Lady Lydia's voice rose again, carrying that particular pitch designed to reach Eleanor's ears while maintaining the pretense of private conversation. I heard Lord Pemberton considered her once, years ago, before he saw her standing next to normal-sized women. Can you imagine the wedding night? She would break the bed beneath her, and the poor man along with it. The laughter that followed this pronouncement was louder, less restrained, and Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks despite her determination to remain unmoved. Across the ballroom, Clara twirled in her third set, golden curls bouncing, utterly oblivious to her sister's humiliation, and their mother, Lady Harriet, had found a comfortable seat among her old friends, her attention firmly fixed on the dancers and the promising young men who might yet make Clara a brilliant match. Eleanor was alone, as she had always been alone in these glittering rooms full of people who looked through her as though she were made of glass, and she began to move toward the terrace doors with measured steps, her deep blue silk whispering against the polished floor, her spine straight as a rod of iron, her dignity the only armor she had ever possessed against a world determined to find her wanting. The terrace stretched before Eleanor like a sanctuary, its stone balustrade gleaming silver beneath the waning moon, and she crossed to the far corner where jasmine climbed in fragrant profusion over an ornamental trellis, its white blossoms trembling in the gentle breeze that carried the distant strains of a waltz from the ballroom behind her. Here, finally, she allowed herself to breathe, drawing the cool night air deep into her lungs and releasing it in a shuddering exhale that carried with it the rigid control she had maintained through Lady Lydia's assault, through the muffled laughter that had followed her retreat, through the endless walk across a ballroom that had felt miles wide, though it could not have been more than 20 feet from the refreshment table to these blessed doors. She gripped the stone balustrade with both hands, feeling its cool solidity beneath her palms, anchoring herself to something real while the echo of those words reverberated through her mind. She would break the bed beneath her, and the poor man along with it. The tears came then, as she had known they would, sliding silently down her cheeks in hot tracks that she despised even as she could not prevent them, and she pressed one gloved hand to her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape, that animal sound of grief she would not permit herself to release where anyone might hear. She had believed herself armored against such cruelty after so many years of enduring it, had thought the calluses built upon her heart thick enough to deflect any barb, yet somehow Lady Lydia's words had found the soft tissue beneath, had pierced through to that tender place where a younger Eleanor still harbored foolish dreams of being seen, being wanted, being loved. The moonlight caught the deep blue silk of her gown, transforming it to something almost beautiful, and she stared down at her own substantial shadow cast upon the terrace stones, wondering what cosmic jest had placed her soul in this body that society found so unacceptable, so worthy of ridicule, so utterly beyond the pale of desirability. She did not know that she was being observed, could not sense the presence of the tall figure in formal black who had stepped onto the terrace moments after her arrival, seeking his own escape from the crush of the ballroom he had only just entered after a delayed journey from his country estate. Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, stood in the deeper shadows near the doors, arrested by the sight of a woman in blue silk pressing her hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling with suppressed emotion, and something in his chest constricted at this raw display of private pain. He watched as she wiped her cheeks with quick, almost angry movements, watched as she drew herself up to her full considerable height, watched as she squared those shoulders and lifted her chin with a dignity that struck him as more genuinely noble than anything he had witnessed in a decade of diplomatic service among the crowned heads of Europe. She turned, and for one breath their eyes might have met across the moonlit terrace, but she was looking past him, through him, seeing only the doors that would return her to the glittering torture of the ballroom, and she walked back inside with her spine straight as a soldier's, leaving Frederick standing alone among the jasmine, thoroughly and unexpectedly intrigued. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Frederick entered the ballroom precisely 15 minutes after the woman in blue silk had passed him without seeing, and he found himself immediately engulfed by the very social tide he had hoped to avoid by arriving late. A wave of silk-clad matrons and their eager daughters surging toward him with the coordinated precision of a military advance, each face bearing that particular expression of calculating welcome that had driven him to accept diplomatic postings in the most remote courts of Europe rather than endure another London season. "Your Grace, we had quite despaired of your arrival," cooed Lady Montague, her daughter hovering at her elbow like a pastel-coloured shadow, and Frederick murmured something appropriately non-committal while his eyes swept the crowded room in search of a particular shade of deep blue, a particular set of shoulders held with that remarkable dignity he had witnessed on the moonlit terrace. He spotted Lord Thomas Greville near the card-room entrance and extricated himself from the clutches of Lady Montague with a bow that was polite enough to avoid offence, but brief enough to discourage pursuit, weaving through the press of bodies until he reached his oldest friend with a relief he did not bother to disguise. "Thomas," he said, and Lord Thomas raised an eyebrow at his tone, the two men having known each other since their school days at Eton, when Frederick had been merely the spare to a sickly heir, and Thomas had been the impoverished son of a baron with more debts than prospects. "You look as though you have seen something extraordinary," Thomas observed, and Frederick realized that his face must be betraying more than he intended, that the woman on the terrace had somehow pierced the diplomatic mask he had perfected over a decade of navigating far more treacherous waters than a London ballroom. "Who is she?" he asked without preamble. The tall woman in blue silk with dark hair, and Thomas followed his gaze to the corner where Eleanor had retreated, where she sat now in a gilt chair, half hidden by a potted palm, a small leather-bound volume open in her hands, her attention so thoroughly absorbed by its pages that she appeared entirely unaware of the glittering spectacle swirling around her. Thomas made a small sound of surprise before answering, "That would be Miss Eleanor Ashworth, the elder daughter of the late Baron Ashworth, quite on the shelf, I am afraid, must be 27 if she is a day, and her mother has long since abandoned any hope of a match, focusing all efforts on the younger daughter, the pretty one dancing with Viscount Pemberton." Frederick watched Eleanor turn a page with delicate precision, watched the candlelight catch the curve of her cheek and the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, and he found himself utterly fascinated by this woman who brought a book to a ball, who read philosophy while her sister danced, who wept alone on terraces and then straightened her spine and returned to face her tormentors with a grace that put every diamond-draped debutante in the room to shame. "She is magnificent," he said quietly, and Thomas stared at him as though he had lost his mind entirely. Frederick excused himself from Thomas with a murmured word and crossed the ballroom floor with the same purposeful stride that had carried him through the gilded corridors of the Russian imperial court and the marble halls of the Austrian Empire. Yet he found his pulse quickening in a manner entirely unfamiliar as he approached the corner where Eleanor Ashworth sat absorbed in her reading, her dark head bent over the small volume in a posture of such complete absorption that she did not notice his shadow falling across the page until he spoke. "I confess myself curious," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "What manner of book proves more compelling than the finest orchestra in London and the combined efforts of 200 guests to provide entertainment?" Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with an alarm that she quickly masked behind an expression of polite neutrality, and Frederick watched the transformation with fascination, watched her construct her defenses in real time as she recognized his evening attire, his bearing, the unmistakable markers of rank that identified him as someone who should have no business addressing a wallflower in a shadowed corner. "Your Grace," she said, and he noted that her voice did not waver despite the surprise evident in her eyes. I was not aware that my reading habits were of interest to anyone present this evening, least of all a gentleman of your standing." He smiled at the delicate barb embedded in her politeness and gestured toward the book she had instinctively pressed closed against her bodice, the title obscured by her gloved fingers. "I spent 10 years in diplomatic service, Miss Ashworth, reading the character of those around me became something of a professional necessity, and a woman who brings Wollstonecraft to a ball is a woman whose character I find myself eager to understand." The shock that flickered across her features was genuine and unguarded, her composure cracking for just a moment before she recovered, with a self-deprecating lift of one shoulder that Frederick found unexpectedly endearing. "You have caught me out, Your Grace," she admitted. "I find the discourse on the rights of women rather more stimulating than discourse on the weather and the shocking price of ribbon, though I suspect that confession marks me as quite beyond redemption in polite society." "On the contrary," Frederick replied, leaning slightly closer, "it marks you as the only person in this room worth conversing with," and he watched the color rise in her cheeks, watched her struggle to categorize this exchange, to fit it into her understanding of how the world worked, an understanding that clearly did not include dukes seeking out spinsters for discussions of political philosophy. Before she could formulate a response, a breathless voice interrupted them. "Eleanor, I need you at once." Clara Ashworth appeared at her sister's elbow, her pretty face flushed from dancing and her eyes flickering with barely concealed curiosity toward Frederick. "My hem has torn, and Mamma cannot leave Lady Weston, and you simply must come help me." And Eleanor rose immediately, her book disappearing into her reticule with practiced efficiency, her face once again composed into that mask of patient resignation that Frederick was beginning to recognize as her armor against a world that had given her little reason to expect kindness. She curtsied without meeting his eyes, and allowed her sister to pull her away. But Frederick remained standing in the corner she had vacated, breathing in the faint scent of lavender she had left behind, more intrigued than ever by the woman who read Revolution at balls and expected nothing from dukes but dismissal. The final hour of the Marchioness of Harcourt's spring ball found Frederick standing near the entrance to the card-room, his eyes tracking Lady Harriet Ashworth as she made her farewells to a cluster of elderly matrons, and he recognized this as his opportunity, perhaps his only opportunity before the evening ended, to learn something of substance about the woman who had retreated from his presence with such practiced efficiency, as though she had long ago learned that attention from men of his station led only to disappointment or mockery. He crossed the ballroom floor with purpose, intercepting Lady Harriet just as she turned toward the doors where servants waited with wraps and cloaks, and he watched the color drain from her face and then return in a rush of surprised pink as she registered who had stopped before her with a bow that protocol demanded but that he offered with genuine warmth. "Lady Harriet," he said, "I hope you will forgive my forwardness in approaching without a proper introduction, but I found myself in conversation with your elder daughter earlier this evening, and was struck by her remarkable intellect, and I wondered if I might call upon your family to continue our discussion of political philosophy." The expression that crossed Lady Harriet's face was one Frederick had seen before in diplomatic negotiations, that particular look of a person rapidly recalculating every assumption they had carried into a conversation, and he waited patiently while she struggled to reconcile his words with whatever understanding she had held of her elder daughter's place in the world. "Your Grace is too kind," she finally managed, her voice carrying that tremulous note of hope that mothers of unmarried daughters could never quite suppress in the presence of eligible dukes. "We would be most honored by your visit. We attend services at St. George's in Hanover Square and are generally at home on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." Frederick filed this information away with the same precision he had once applied to memorizing the political allegiances of foreign courts, already planning how he might arrange to encounter Eleanor Ashworth in the more intimate setting of a Sunday service. From across the ballroom, he was aware of Eleanor watching this exchange, her face carefully blank in that way he was beginning to recognize as her shield against hope, and he knew with sudden certainty that she was misinterpreting everything she observed, that she was assuming his attention to her mother signaled interest in her younger sister, that she was even now reinforcing the walls she had built around her heart with fresh mortar mixed from years of being overlooked. Lady Lydia Carstairs stood near the refreshment table, with her fan raised to hide her lips, her sharp eyes darting between Frederick and the Ashworth family, and he could see the calculations happening behind her gaze, the jealousy kindling at the sight of him paying attention to anyone connected to the woman she had mocked so cruelly. The Ashworth carriage was called, and Frederick watched Eleanor wrap herself in a worn shawl against the night air that had cooled considerably since the unseasonably warm early evening, watched her follow her mother and sister toward the doors without once looking back, her spine straight and her head held high, utterly certain that nothing had changed and nothing ever would. The bells of St. George's Church in Hanover Square rang out across the Sunday morning air on April 19th, 1814, their pealing tones calling the faithful to worship as Eleanor Ashworth ascended the stone steps between her mother and sister, her modest grey dress a deliberate choice of invisibility against the more vibrant plumage of the society women who gathered on the church steps to see and be seen before entering the sacred space within. 4 days had passed since the Marchioness of Harcourt's spring ball, 4 days during which Eleanor had systematically dismantled every moment of her brief conversation with the Duke of Somerton, and rebuilt it as meaningless coincidence, as the idle curiosity of a bored nobleman who had stumbled upon an oddity and would never spare her another thought. She had performed this mental exercise with the thoroughness of long practice, stripping away any lingering warmth the memory might have held until it sat cold and harmless in her mind. Just another evening of being overlooked, just another reminder that hope was a luxury she could not afford. The interior of the church glowed with coloured light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting patterns of ruby and sapphire and gold across the polished pews, and Eleanor followed her mother toward their customary seats near the middle of the nave, her eyes downcast in appropriate Sunday contemplation until some instinct made her raise them. And there, seated in the pew directly across the aisle, in a position that would have required either remarkable coincidence or deliberate strategy, sat Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch and her step falter. She looked away immediately, heat rising to her cheeks as she chastised herself for the foolish flutter of her pulse, for the way her heart insisted on leaping, despite all her careful work to keep it still. And she spent the entire service acutely aware of his presence across the aisle, of every moment when she might have turned her head and found him watching her, though she kept her gaze fixed firmly on her prayer book. When the service concluded and the congregation began to file out into the spring sunshine, Eleanor attempted to lose herself in the crowd, but Mrs. Agnes Pembroke, their kindly neighbour, whose round face always seemed to hold a genuine smile for Eleanor when others looked through her, appeared at Lady Harriet's elbow with an invitation to tea that very afternoon, and before Eleanor could formulate an excuse, the Duke himself had approached their small group with a bow and a greeting that somehow included her mother's name, her sister's name, and her own name with equal weight, and when Mrs. Pembroke extended her invitation to include him, citing his diplomatic service with her late husband's cousin, he accepted with a warmth that left Clara visibly disappointed and Lady Harriet bewildered but pleased, and Eleanor standing in a shaft of coloured sunlight, wondering if the world had somehow shifted beneath her feet without anyone else noticing. Mrs. Pembroke's drawing-room smelled of roses and lemon tea, the delicate rose-patterned china catching the grey afternoon light that filtered through windows streaked with the first drops of rain, and Eleanor sat in a chair near the window where she could observe the gathering, while maintaining the careful distance she had perfected over years of existing at the edges of social occasions, watching as Clara arranged herself prettily on the settee closest to where the Duke of Somerton would surely choose to sit, her younger sister's golden curls catching what little light remained as the clouds thickened outside and the rain began in earnest, drumming against the glass in a rhythm that seemed to match the anxious beating of Eleanor's heart. Frederick accepted the cup Mrs. Pembroke offered him, and then, to the visible confusion of every woman in the room, he crossed to the chair nearest Eleanor's window seat rather than taking his place beside the beautiful younger Ashworth daughter, and when he settled into the worn velvet cushion, his knee was close enough to Eleanor's skirts that she could feel the warmth of his presence even through the layers of fabric that separated them. "I understand from Lord Castlereagh that the Congress will convene in Vienna before the year is out," Frederick said, his voice pitched for Eleanor alone, though the small room made privacy impossible, "and I find myself curious what you make of the proposed territorial settlements, Miss Ashworth, given your evident interest in political philosophy." The seed cake turned to ash in Eleanor's mouth as she registered the genuine inquiry in his tone, the way his dark eyes held hers without wavering, without sliding toward Clara's more appealing form, as she had expected, as she had been certain would happen the moment the initial novelty of speaking to the overlooked spinster wore thin. She swallowed hard and glanced at her mother, who was staring at her with an expression that combined bewilderment with something that might have been the first stirrings of hope, and Mrs. Pembroke had paused with the teapot suspended in midair, and Clara's pretty mouth had fallen open in a manner that would have earned a sharp correction had Lady Harriet been paying attention to anyone other than her elder daughter. "I believe," Eleanor began, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, "that any settlement which fails to account for the aspirations of the peoples being divided like parcels of land will plant the seeds of future conflict, and that the great powers would do well to remember that maps drawn in palace rooms must eventually be lived upon by ordinary people who care little for the ambitions of emperors." The smile that spread across Frederick's face was unlike any expression Eleanor had ever seen directed at her, warm and delighted, and carrying within it something that looked remarkably like admiration, and when he laughed, a genuine sound of pleasure at her words, Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built so long ago she had forgotten it existed. And for one brief and terrifying moment she allowed herself to imagine that this attention might be real, might be meant for her and her alone, before the familiar voice of caution whispered that such hopes were the province of other women, women like Clara, and never meant for women like Eleanor Ashworth. The morning post arrived at the Ashworth townhouse on April 22nd, 1814, carried on a silver tray by their aging butler, whose measured footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway where Eleanor sat in the small parlour reserved for family use, her needle moving steadily through a stocking that had worn thin at the heel, the grey morning light filtering through rain-streaked windows, as it had done for 3 days now, as though the heavens themselves had decided to match the uncertain weather of her heart with an endless drizzle that kept sensible people indoors, and left Eleanor with nothing to do but mend and think and remember the way Frederick Ravenscroft had laughed at her words about territorial settlements, the way his eyes had held hers across Mrs. Pembroke's rose-patterned china as though she were saying something worth hearing, as though she were someone worth seeing. She had spent 3 days dismantling that afternoon, as she had dismantled the ball, pulling apart each moment and examining it for the flaw that would reveal the whole encounter as meaningless. But somehow the seams would not come undone. Somehow the memory kept reassembling itself into something that looked terrifyingly like genuine interest, and she stabbed her needle through the worn wool with rather more force than necessary, as punishment for her own foolish hope. Clara swept into the parlour in a cloud of pink muslin and perfume just as the butler entered with the post, her golden curls arranged artfully despite having no plans to leave the house, her blue eyes brightening at the sight of the cream-coloured envelope bearing a seal that even from across the room Eleanor recognized as belonging to no ordinary correspondent. "That will be for me?" Clara announced, reaching for the letter before the butler could present the tray properly, and Eleanor watched her sister's face as she broke the seal with eager fingers, watched the anticipation transform first into confusion and then into something harder and colder as Clara read the direction written within. "It says Eleanor," Clara said, her voice flat and strange. "The Duke of Somerton requests the pleasure of Miss Eleanor Ashworth's company for a private viewing of the Italian collection at Montague Gallery," and he specifically writes Eleanor, not Miss Ashworth, as though there could be any doubt which sister he means. Lady Harriet appeared in the doorway, drawn by some maternal instinct for brewing conflict, and Eleanor set aside her mending with hands that trembled only slightly as Clara thrust the invitation toward their mother with an expression of wounded betrayal. "There must be some mistake," Eleanor said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie, knew that Frederick Ravenscroft was not a man who made mistakes in his correspondence, and when her mother finished reading and looked up with an expression that combined bewilderment with the first glimmers of something like wonder, Eleanor felt the careful architecture of her resigned acceptance begin to crack like ice on a spring pond. "You will accept," Lady Harriet said firmly, silencing Clara's protests with a raised hand, for one did not refuse a duke, and Eleanor sat in the grey morning light with an invitation in her mother's hands, and her sister's tears beginning to fall, and the terrifying possibility that hope might not be foolishness after all, taking root in her chest, despite every effort she had made to keep that particular garden barren and safe. The Montague Gallery stood quiet on the afternoon of April 24th, 1814, its high ceilings and marble floors lending a hush to the space that felt almost sacred, and Eleanor moved through the Italian Renaissance collection with her heart beating so loudly she was certain Frederick could hear it despite maintaining the proper distance required by propriety, her mother trailing somewhere behind them, distracted by a chance encounter with an old acquaintance whose voice echoed faintly from the gallery's far end, leaving Eleanor more alone with the Duke of Somerton than she had ever been with any man, and the terror of it sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. She paused before a painting of Venus rising from the sea, the goddess rendered in soft curves and generous flesh that bore no resemblance to the willowy ideals society currently worshipped, and she felt Frederick stop beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his soap, and something else, something warm and particular to him that she had begun to recognize in her dreams. "The artist understood," Frederick said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that it felt like a secret shared between them. "That beauty wears many forms, and that the most enduring kind has nothing to do with conforming to fashionable standards that change with each passing decade." Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the painting, because looking at him would undo her entirely, and she heard herself say with the dry humour that had become her armour, "I suspect Venus had fewer freckles and rather better prospects than the average English spinster, Your Grace." Frederick did not laugh, and when she finally risked a glance at his face, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his dark eyes holding questions she was not certain she could bear to answer. "Why do you do that?" he asked, and there was no accusation in his tone, only genuine curiosity and something that might have been pain on her behalf. "Why do you hide behind wit and self-deprecation, as though diminishing yourself might make you safer from the world's cruelty?" Eleanor's hand trembled as she removed her glove to touch the cool marble base of a nearby sculpture, needing something solid beneath her fingers, while the foundation of her carefully constructed resignation cracked beneath his gentle persistence. "Because it does," she whispered, and the truth of it burned her throat like unshed tears. "Because if I name my flaws before others can use them as weapons, they lose some of their power to wound me, and I have been wounded enough, Your Grace, to know that hope is the cruelest cut of all." The silence stretched between them, filled with dust motes dancing in the pale light filtering through high windows, and when Frederick spoke again, his voice carried a roughness she had not heard before, a rawness that matched her own unexpected vulnerability. "Then I shall have to prove to you, Miss Ashworth, that hope need not be cruel, and that the world's judgment of your worth bears no resemblance to my own, however long such proof requires." And Eleanor stood in the gallery, surrounded by Renaissance beauty, with her ungloved hand pressed against cold marble, and her carefully guarded heart beginning to believe the impossible. The musicalet at Lady Spencer's townhouse on the evening of April 28th, 1814, glittered with candlelight and the rustle of silk as Eleanor took her seat in the second row of gilded chairs arranged before the pianoforte, her new forest green gown feeling like armor and vulnerability all at once, the fabric cut more daringly than anything she had worn in years, because her mother had insisted, and because some small rebellious part of Eleanor had wanted Frederick to see her in something other than the muted colours she usually chose to fade into wallpaper, and when he entered the drawing-room with Lord Thomas at his side, his dark eyes found hers across the crowded space with an immediacy that made her breath catch and her fingers tighten in her lap. 4 days since the gallery. 4 days of reliving every word he had spoken about hope and worth and patience. 4 days of fighting the treacherous warmth that bloomed in her chest each time she remembered the roughness in his voice when he had made his promise. Frederick claimed the empty chair beside her with a murmured greeting to Lady Harriet that was perfectly proper, and yet somehow felt like a declaration. And Eleanor was acutely aware of the whispers that rippled through the room like stones cast into still water, aware of Lady Lydia Carstairs watching from 3 rows back, with eyes sharp as broken glass, aware that every matron present was cataloguing this moment to dissect over breakfast tomorrow. The Mozart sonata began, delicate notes filling the air like crystal rain, but Eleanor heard little of it over the thunder of her own pulse and the quiet commentary filtering from behind her. Surely he cannot mean to court her in earnest. Perhaps it is a wager among gentlemen. She would crush him on their wedding night, and she felt her cheeks burn with humiliation even as she kept her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the performer's flying fingers. During the intermission, Frederick turned to her with deliberate attention, asking her opinion of the interpretation with genuine interest in his voice, and Eleanor answered because not answering would be worse, because silence would be surrender. And when she mentioned that the pianist had taken unusual liberties with the tempo in the second movement, Frederick's smile reached his eyes in a way that made her forget momentarily that they were surrounded by people who thought her unworthy of his notice. Lady Lydia's voice cut through the genteel murmur of conversation with practiced precision, loud enough to carry without being obviously vulgar. One wonders what the Duke finds so fascinating about Miss Ashworth's musical opinions when her only instrument is the fork. And Eleanor watched Frederick's jaw tighten, watched something cold and dangerous flash across his features before he mastered it, watched Lord Thomas shift his weight as though preparing to intervene, and she thought with a strange calm that she should be used to this by now, should be armoured against it. But somehow Lady Lydia's cruelty cut deeper when Frederick was present to witness her humiliation, when his good opinion was something she had begun to crave like air. The afternoon of May 2nd, 1814, brought the kind of spring sunshine that made Hyde Park glow like something from a painting, and Eleanor sat beside Frederick in his curricle, with her heart caught somewhere between terror and a joy so foreign she barely recognized it. The blue ribbons of her bonnet fluttering in the gentle breeze as they joined the parade of carriages and riders taking the fashionable hour along Rotten Row, and she was acutely aware of every eye that turned their direction, every whisper that would follow them home, every raised eyebrow from matrons who could not fathom what the Duke of Somerton was doing with the overlooked Ashworth daughter when her pretty sister sat at home nursing wounded pride. Frederick handled the ribbons with the easy competence of a man accustomed to excellence in all things, but his attention remained fixed on Eleanor rather than the matched greys stepping smartly before them, and when he spoke his voice carried that particular roughness she had come to recognize as sincerity stripped of social pretense. "I spent 7 years abroad," he said, watching diplomats and courtiers play their endless games of appearance and advantage, and I returned to England with no patience left for pretense, no tolerance for the shallow judgments that pass for conversation in ballrooms, and I find myself wondering, Miss Ashworth, whether you might understand what it means to stand apart from a world that values the wrong things entirely. Eleanor felt the spring air catch in her throat as she considered his words, considered the loneliness threaded through them that echoed her own so precisely it ached, and she heard herself answering with a honesty she had not permitted herself in years. "I once had hopes," she admitted, watching a pair of riders pass them with curious glances. "When I was 18 and foolish enough to believe that someone might see past the obvious to whatever lay beneath. But hope is a luxury that becomes too expensive when it is disappointed often enough, and I learned to stop purchasing what I could not afford." Frederick's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins, and when he turned to look at her, his dark eyes held something fierce and tender all at once that made her breath stutter in her chest. "Then you have been purchasing from merchants who dealt in counterfeit goods," he said quietly, "and I intend to prove that genuine worth exists, that it has always existed in you, waiting only to be recognized by someone with eyes unclouded by fashionable blindness." The curricle passed beneath the dappled shade of ancient oaks as Eleanor sat beside a man who spoke to her, as though her thoughts mattered, as though her presence brought him pleasure rather than obligation, and she felt the careful architecture of her resignation developing cracks that terrified her even as she could not bring herself to shore them up. Around them the park blazed with spring flowers and the murmur of polite society, but Eleanor existed in a smaller world, bounded by the curricle's frame and Frederick's proximity, and when his gloved hand brushed against hers, reaching for the lap blanket against the breeze, she did not pull away. The morning of May 6th, 1814, arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the lace curtains of Eleanor's bedroom, illuminating the roses and forget-me-nots that Frederick had sent just yesterday, their fragrance mingling with the scent of the leather-bound volume of poetry that lay open on her nightstand, its margins filled with his precise handwriting, offering observations and questions clearly meant to spark conversation between them, and Eleanor sat at her small writing desk attempting to compose a thank-you note that would not betray how desperately she had come to anticipate each delivery, each small token that proved the curricle ride and the gallery and the musicale had not been fever dreams conjured by a lonely woman's imagination. When her bedroom door burst open without ceremony, and Clara stood in the threshold with red-rimmed eyes and a fury that transformed her delicate features into something Eleanor barely recognized. "You have stolen everything," Clara spat, her voice trembling with weeks of suppressed resentment, finally finding release. "You who were supposed to be invisible, you who were supposed to chaperone and fade into corners and leave the eligible men for those of us who still had a chance. And now the Duke of Somerton sends you flowers while I receive nothing, sends you books with love notes in the margins while I am pitied by every girl who debuted with me. And I want to know what arts you employed, what deception you practiced to turn his head from where it naturally should have fallen." Eleanor rose from her desk with a heaviness in her chest that had nothing to do with her sister's accusations and everything to do with the guilt she had been carrying since the first moment she allowed herself to hope. And she heard herself answering with a weariness that surprised them both. "I employed no arts because I possess none," she said quietly. "I understand his interest no better than you do. I wake each morning expecting to learn it was a mistake, or a wager, or a temporary madness, and if you believe I wished to cause you pain, then you know nothing of the years I spent making myself small so that you might shine." Lady Harriet appeared in the doorway then, drawn by raised voices, and Eleanor braced herself for the familiar weight of her mother's disappointment, for the gentle suggestion that perhaps Eleanor should discourage the Duke's attentions for the sake of family harmony. But instead Lady Harriet crossed the room and placed herself between her daughters with an expression Eleanor had never seen before, something fierce and protective that seemed directed, impossibly, at Eleanor herself. "Clara, enough," Lady Harriet said with quiet authority. "Your sister has spent 9 years diminishing herself for this family's sake, has refused her own happiness so completely that she forgot she deserved any. And if a man of sense and position has finally recognized what we should have celebrated all along, I will not permit you to poison it with jealousy." After Clara fled, weeping, and Lady Harriet followed to comfort her, Eleanor stood alone among Frederick's gifts, touching the soft petals of roses that someone had chosen specifically for her, reading again the words he had written in margins meant only for her eyes, and she felt something cracking open in her chest that might have been terror or might have been the first genuine hope she had permitted herself in nearly a decade. The evening of May 10th, 1814, blazed with the light of 1,000 candles in the Countess of Montague's ballroom, their flames reflected in gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the entire space seemed to shimmer with golden fire. And Eleanor stood at the edge of this magnificence in her midnight blue gown, feeling simultaneously more hopeful and more terrified than she had felt in all her 27 years, because she had resolved during the 4 days since her mother's unexpected defense to stop bracing for disappointment and simply allow herself to experience whatever joy remained before Frederick inevitably came to his senses and redirected his attention toward someone society would not mock him for choosing. She had taken unusual care with her appearance tonight, permitted the maid to dress her hair with pearl pins that had belonged to her grandmother, and when she caught sight of herself in the entrance hall mirror, she had thought, just for a moment, that she looked almost handsome, in a substantial, unconventional way that might appeal to a man who had spent 7 years learning to see past surfaces. Frederick found her within moments of her arrival, crossing the crowded ballroom with a purposefulness that drew every eye and set tongues wagging before he even reached her side. And when he bowed over her hand, his dark gaze held that particular intensity she had come to recognize as genuine pleasure rather than polite obligation. He claimed her for the first dance before she could protest, and then, scandalously, for the second as well. And Eleanor felt the weight of society's attention pressing against her skin as they took their positions for the waltz, his hand warm and steady at her waist, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it over the orchestra's opening notes. They moved together with a grace that surprised her, his lead confident and sure, her body responding to his guidance as though they had danced together 100 times before, and for a few precious moments Eleanor forgot the watching eyes and wagging tongues, and existed only in the circle of Frederick's arms, in the warmth of his gaze fixed upon her face as though she were the only woman in the room. It was during the second dance that Lady Lydia's voice cut through Eleanor's happiness like a blade through silk, pitched just loud enough to carry over the music, wondering aloud to her companion how the floorboards were bearing up under such unprecedented strain, and whether the Duke had taken leave of his senses or merely his eyesight. Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, felt her steps falter and her cheeks flame with the familiar burn of public humiliation, and she would have pulled away, would have fled toward the shadows where she belonged. But Frederick's hand tightened at her waist, and his fingers interlaced with hers, holding her in place with gentle implacability, and when she dared to meet his eyes, she saw not embarrassment or regret, but a cold fury that transformed his handsome features into something almost frightening. He did not release her when the music ended, did not allow her to retreat as every instinct screamed she must, and Eleanor understood with dawning wonder that this man intended to fight for her in a ballroom full of people who had spent years teaching her she was not worth fighting for. The music swelled into its opening notes, but Eleanor heard nothing beyond the rushing of blood in her ears, felt nothing beyond the firm pressure of Frederick's fingers interlaced with her own as he guided her away from the dance floor with a deliberateness that drew every eye in the glittering ballroom, and she wanted desperately to pull free, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged, where Lady Lydia's words could not find her, and where she would not have to witness the moment when Frederick finally recognized the mistake he had made in singling her out before all of London society. But he did not release her, did not allow her even a single step toward retreat, and instead he led her toward the refreshment table. With his head held high and his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed room as he said, "Miss Ashworth, I find myself parched after such an exhilarating dance with the most captivating woman in attendance, and would you do me the honor of taking refreshment with me, while I tell you how thoroughly I have enjoyed every moment of this evening?" Eleanor felt the words wash over her like warm water, felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing against her flushed skin, and she understood with dawning amazement that Frederick was not merely escorting her to safety, but making a declaration that every gossip and social climber in the room would remember and repeat for weeks to come. He handed her a glass of champagne with a tenderness that made her throat ache, and then he turned to face the watching crowd with an expression of such cold authority that even Lady Lydia seemed to shrink back into the gathered assembly, and his voice rang out with the unmistakable command of a man accustomed to addressing foreign courts and parliamentary chambers. "I have travelled extensively these past 7 years," he said, his gaze sweeping the room with deliberate slowness. And I have learned that true beauty reveals itself not in the cut of a gown or the arrangement of features, but in the quality of mind and steadfastness of character, and I consider myself fortunate beyond measure to have found both in such abundance after so long believing they did not exist among the drawing-rooms of London. Lord Thomas had positioned himself near the terrace doors with an expression of barely concealed delight, and Eleanor saw several society matrons exchange glances of shock and rapid recalculation as they absorbed the implications of the Duke of Somerton declaring his preference so publicly and so unmistakably. Lady Lydia's face had transformed from smug satisfaction to something approaching horror as she recognized that her cruel comment had not achieved its intended effect of driving Frederick away from Eleanor, but had instead prompted him to defend her before the entire assembled company with a passion that left no doubt about his intentions. Eleanor's hand trembled in Frederick's grasp as he turned back to her with eyes that held no trace of embarrassment or regret, only a fierce tenderness that made her believe, for the first time in nearly a decade, that perhaps she had been wrong about what she deserved, and perhaps this extraordinary man truly saw something in her worth fighting for. The terrace air wrapped around Eleanor like a cool embrace as she slipped through the same doors she had fled through nearly a month ago, and the jasmine bloomed even more heavily now, its sweetness almost overwhelming in the warm May evening, and she pressed her trembling fingers against the stone balustrade and tried to calm the wild beating of her heart while her mind struggled to comprehend what had just transpired in the ballroom behind her. Frederick's voice ringing out in her defense, his hand refusing to release hers, his eyes blazing with that fierce tenderness that made her want to weep and laugh and run all at once. The moon hung full and luminous overhead, casting silver light across the garden below, and Eleanor remembered how it had been, waning that first night when she had stood in this exact spot and allowed herself to cry where no one could witness her shame. And now here she was again, with tears threatening but for entirely different reasons, and she heard his footsteps before she saw him, measured and deliberate, and she knew without turning that Frederick had followed her into the darkness. He stopped beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the distant strains of the orchestra and the chirping of night insects filling the silence between them. "I stood in the shadows that night," Frederick said softly, his voice low and intimate in a way that made Eleanor's breath catch. "And I watched you weep, and then I watched you dry your tears and straighten your spine, and walk back into that ballroom with more dignity than anyone inside it deserved. And I knew in that moment that I had found something I had spent 7 years believing did not exist." Eleanor turned to face him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and she whispered, "I am afraid, Frederick. I am so terribly afraid that I will wake tomorrow and discover this was all a dream or a mistake or some elaborate jest at my expense, because I have spent 10 years learning that women like me do not receive the attentions of men like you, and I do not know how to unlearn that lesson in the space of a single evening." Frederick reached for her hand, and this time he drew off his own glove first before taking hers, and the warmth of his bare fingers intertwining with her own sent a shock through Eleanor's entire body as he said, "Then I will spend however long it takes teaching you a different lesson, one that speaks of worth beyond the measurement society uses to diminish remarkable women, one that recognizes the extraordinary mind and generous heart I have had the privilege of discovering these past weeks." And he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that burned through her skin like a brand. "May I court you properly, Eleanor Ashworth?" he asked, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt or dismissal. "May I call upon your mother tomorrow and make my intentions known? May I prove to you day by day that what I feel is neither jest nor passing fancy, but the truest recognition of my life?" And Eleanor heard herself whisper yes before her cautious mind could form a single objection. They returned to the ballroom together, Eleanor's hand still resting in the crook of Frederick's arm, and she felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward them as they crossed the threshold from moonlit terrace to candlelit splendor, felt the whispers rising like a tide around them. And yet for the first time in her memory she did not shrink from the attention or wish herself invisible, because Frederick's steady presence beside her seemed to create a shield against the cruelty she had endured for so long, and when he guided her toward the corner where Lord Thomas stood with an expression of knowing amusement, Eleanor understood that something fundamental had shifted in the universe she inhabited, that the rules she had learned through years of painful experience no longer applied in quite the same way. Lord Thomas bowed to Eleanor with genuine warmth in his eyes and said, "Miss Ashworth, I do hope you will forgive my friend his rather dramatic tendencies. He has always had a flair for making declarations at the most unexpected moments," and Frederick responded with a quiet laugh that rumbled through his chest as he replied, "Thomas, I intend to call upon Lady Harriet Ashworth tomorrow morning to formally request permission to court her daughter, and I wanted you to hear it from me before the gossips twist the tale beyond recognition." Eleanor felt her breath catch at the casual certainty in Frederick's voice, at the way he spoke of tomorrow as though it were already assured, as though the dawn would not bring regret or reconsideration, and Lord Thomas's smile broadened as he said, "I have known you for 15 years, Frederick, and I have never once seen you dance twice with the same woman at any ball, so I rather suspected something momentous was afoot when you claimed Miss Ashworth for both the cotillion and the waltz." The orchestra struck up another set, and the dancers began to assemble, and Eleanor watched as Lady Lydia Carstairs attempted to catch Frederick's eye from across the room, only to be met with a gaze so cold and dismissive that even from this distance Eleanor could see the woman flinch, and she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and discomfort at witnessing the reversal of fortune that had placed her tormentor in the position of being publicly snubbed by the most eligible man in the room. Frederick turned to Eleanor with an expression of such tender concern that her heart ached, and he said softly, "I know you are tired and overwhelmed, and I know that tomorrow morning you will wake and wonder if tonight was real, so I want you to carry this knowledge with you into sleep. I have spent 7 years in foreign courts, searching for something I could not name, and I found it on a moonlit terrace, watching a woman refuse to let cruelty break her spirit, and nothing that happens between now and tomorrow will change my intentions." Eleanor felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of something she barely recognized after so many years of resignation, something that felt dangerously like joy, and she whispered, "I will try to believe you," and Frederick smiled and said, "That is all I ask for now." The carriage ride home felt like a dream from which Eleanor feared waking, her mother's voice a distant murmur of questions and exclamations while Clara sat rigid and silent in the corner, her pretty face turned toward the window where gaslight flickered past like dying stars, and Eleanor pressed her fingers against the spot on her hand, where Frederick's lips had touched her bare skin, and tried to memorize the sensation before morning stole it away, along with all the other impossible things that had happened in the space of a single evening. Lady Harriet's astonishment had given way to a kind of breathless excitement that Eleanor had not seen in her mother since before her father's death, and she kept repeating phrases like "quite extraordinary" and "never would have imagined." And what will Lady Pembroke say? While Eleanor sat wrapped in silence and wonder, and the lingering scent of jasmine that clung to her midnight blue gown like a promise she was afraid to believe. When they arrived at the townhouse, Clara swept inside without a word and disappeared up the stairs, and Eleanor heard the distant slam of her bedroom door and felt the familiar weight of guilt settle in her chest, even as another part of her, a part she had thought long dead, whispered that she deserved this happiness, that 27 years of invisibility had earned her this single moment of being seen. Lady Harriet took Eleanor's hands in her own and looked at her with an expression that held something Eleanor had never expected to find there, something that looked remarkably like respect, and she said softly, "I confess I did not understand what the Duke saw in you at first. I thought perhaps he was being kind or curious or simply unconventional, but tonight I watched a man defend my daughter before all of society, and I saw in his eyes what I once saw in your father's eyes when he looked at me. And I am sorry, Eleanor, that I did not see your worth more clearly before a duke had to show it to me." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she embraced her mother, felt the fragile bridge being built between them after years of distance and disappointment, and she whispered, "I am afraid, Mamma. I am so afraid that tomorrow he will change his mind." And Lady Harriet pulled back and cupped Eleanor's face in her weathered hands and said, "Then we shall face tomorrow together. But tonight you will sleep knowing that you are extraordinary, that you have always been extraordinary, and that some truths do not change with the sunrise." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, where Frederick's gifts still surrounded her, the roses and forget-me-nots filling the air with sweetness, the annotated poetry books stacked beside her bed, and she sat at her window looking out at the moon that hung full and luminous over London, and allowed herself for the first time in a decade to imagine a future that held more than resignation and duty and the slow fade into comfortable invisibility. Somewhere across the city, Frederick Ravenscroft was likely telling Lord Thomas about his plans for the morning, about the formal request he would make to Lady Harriet, about the courtship that would scandalize society and delight the gossips, and ultimately prove that worth had nothing to do with measurements or age or the cruel arithmetic of the marriage market. And Eleanor pressed her hand to her heart and whispered yes into the darkness. The morning of May 11th, 1814, dawned bright and merciless, sunlight streaming through Eleanor's bedroom window with an intensity that seemed designed to expose every doubt and fear she had carried through the restless hours of the night. And she lay in her bed, surrounded by Frederick's gifts, the roses now fully opened and releasing their sweetest perfume, the poetry books with their careful annotations in his elegant hand, and she pressed her palm against her racing heart and whispered to herself that today would bring the truth, that the morning light would reveal whether the moonlit promises had been real or merely the temporary madness of a spring evening. She rose and dressed with trembling fingers, choosing a simple morning gown of pale lavender that she had always thought suited her coloring, and she studied herself in the mirror with the same critical eye that society had trained upon her for 27 years, seeing the height that made her tower over most men, the generous curves that refused to conform to fashionable slenderness, the face that was pleasant enough but had never inspired poetry or passionate declarations, and yet she also saw something new in her reflection, something that looked remarkably like hope, refusing to be extinguished despite her best efforts to protect herself from disappointment. Downstairs, Lady Harriet was already pacing the drawing room in a state of nervous anticipation, having ordered the best tea service laid out and fresh flowers arranged on every surface. And Clara sat in the corner with her needlework, her pretty face arranged in an expression of studied indifference that fooled no one, and the clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes with agonizing slowness as 10 o'clock approached. When the knocker finally sounded at precisely 5 minutes past the hour, Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat and her hands grow cold despite the warmth of the spring morning, and she heard the butler's measured footsteps in the hallway, heard the low murmur of male voices, and then Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room, looking exactly as she remembered him, tall and commanding in a dark blue coat that matched his eyes, his expression grave but his gaze seeking hers immediately across the room with an intensity that made her knees weaken. He bowed to Lady Harriet and then to Clara, observing all the proprieties that society demanded, but his eyes kept returning to Eleanor as though she were a lodestone and he a compass needle unable to point anywhere else. And when he finally approached her and took her hand and raised it to his lips, she saw in his face the same wonder she felt in her own heart, the same disbelief that fate had finally offered them something worth believing in. Frederick turned to Lady Harriet with the formal words he had surely rehearsed, requesting permission to court her eldest daughter with honorable intentions toward matrimony, and Eleanor watched her mother's face transform from nervous anticipation to genuine joy as she granted that permission with more warmth than Eleanor had ever heard in her voice, and Clara's needlework fell forgotten to the floor as she finally understood that the impossible had become real. The days that followed Frederick's formal declaration of courtship passed in a blur of morning calls and afternoon drives and evening entertainments, where Eleanor found herself transformed from invisible wallflower to the most watched woman in London, and she moved through this new existence with a mixture of wonder and terror that made her heart race every time she caught sight of Frederick across a crowded room and saw his face light with the same quiet joy that she felt blooming in her own chest. Lady Lydia Carstairs and her circle of sharp-tongued gossips had not abandoned their cruelty, but had instead refined it into whispered speculation about what hold Eleanor must have over the Duke, what dark arts or desperate manipulation had ensnared a man who could have had any woman in England. And Eleanor heard these whispers everywhere she went, in the retiring rooms at balls, behind fans at musicales, in the sidelong glances of women who had once looked through her as though she were made of glass. But something remarkable had begun to happen in the weeks since Frederick had publicly defended her at the Countess of Montague's ball, and Eleanor noticed it first in the way certain society matrons began to greet her with genuine warmth rather than dismissive politeness, in the invitations that arrived at the Ashworth townhouse addressed specifically to her rather than to the family in general, in the young women who sought her out at parties to ask her opinion on books or politics or the latest parliamentary debates, as though her intelligence were something to be admired rather than hidden. Frederick watched this transformation with visible satisfaction, his eyes following her across crowded rooms as she engaged in conversations that would have been impossible for her a mere month ago, and when they found moments of semi-privacy during their chaperoned outings, he would lean close and whisper observations that made her laugh, would brush his fingers against hers in ways that sent electricity racing up her arm, would look at her with an intensity that made her feel beautiful in a way she had never imagined possible. On May the 15th, 5 days after the formal courtship had begun, Frederick arrived at the Ashworth townhouse not for a morning call, but for a private audience with Lady Harriet, and Eleanor sat in the drawing-room with Clara, who had finally thawed enough to speak to her sister with something approaching civility, and they both pretended to focus on their needlework while straining to hear any sound from the study where their mother and the Duke had closeted themselves. When the door finally opened, and Lady Harriet emerged with tears streaming down her face and a smile so wide it seemed to transform her entirely, Eleanor knew before Frederick even crossed the room to take her hands in his, knew before he spoke the words that would change her life forever, knew that the impossible had become real, and that the woman who had spent 27 years believing herself unworthy of love was about to become a duchess. Frederick knelt before her there in the drawing-room with Clara and Lady Harriet as witnesses, and he said, "Miss Ashworth Eleanor, I have loved you since the moment I watched you straighten your spine on that terrace and refuse to let cruelty break you, and I am asking you now to do me the honor of becoming my wife." Eleanor's voice emerged as barely a whisper when she finally found the strength to speak, her eyes locked on Frederick's face as he knelt before her on the worn carpet of the Ashworth drawing-room, and the word that escaped her lips was simply, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes," and she watched his expression transform from hopeful anticipation to radiant joy as he rose and gathered her hands more firmly in his own, pressing them against his chest where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart that matched the thundering rhythm of her own. Lady Harriet was weeping openly now, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while making sounds that alternated between laughter and sobs, and even Clara had risen from her chair with an expression that held something approaching genuine happiness for her sister, the jealousy and resentment of recent weeks finally giving way to the recognition that Eleanor deserved this moment after so many years of selfless devotion to their family. Frederick raised Eleanor's hand to his lips once more, but this time his kiss lingered, warm and deliberate against her fingers, and when he looked up at her his eyes held promises that made her breath catch in her throat, promises of a future she had never dared to imagine for herself, of mornings spent in conversation over breakfast, of evenings reading together by the fire, of a lifetime of being seen and valued and loved for exactly who she was. The formal announcement would be made that very evening at the Viscount Hastings' dinner party. Frederick explained, as he finally released her hands, and Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of facing society's reaction, of enduring Lady Lydia's poisonous whispers, and the shocked stares of those who had dismissed her as unmarriageable for so long. But when she looked at Frederick's steady gaze, she found the courage she needed to face whatever cruelty awaited them. Lord Thomas arrived within the hour, having been summoned by a hastily dispatched note, and his congratulations were warm and genuine as he clapped Frederick on the shoulder and bowed over Eleanor's hand with theatrical flourish, declaring that he had known from the moment he saw Frederick watching her at that first ball that his friend was utterly and irrevocably lost. The afternoon passed in a flurry of preparations and plans, of Lady Harriet sending servants to fetch Eleanor's finest evening gown for pressing, of Clara quietly offering to arrange Eleanor's hair in a more elaborate style than her sister usually attempted, of Frederick reluctantly departing to make his own preparations while promising to return within hours to escort them to the dinner party where London society would learn that the Duke of Somerton had chosen the woman they had mocked and dismissed as his future Duchess. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window as his carriage pulled away, watching until it disappeared around the corner, and she pressed her palm against the cool glass and allowed herself for the first time to fully believe that this was real, that the man who had defended her honor and declared his love and knelt before her to ask for her hand was truly hers, and that by nightfall all of London would know that Eleanor Ashworth, the spinster they had laughed at, the woman they had called too tall and too wide and too old for any man to want, would become the Duchess of Somerton. The Viscount Hastings' dinner party that evening would live in London memory for decades to come, whispered about in drawing rooms and recorded in the journals of society, matrons who witnessed the moment when the Duke of Somerton stood before the assembled guests and announced his engagement to Eleanor Ashworth, the woman they had dismissed and mocked and pitied for so many seasons, and Eleanor stood beside him in her midnight blue gown, with her hand resting on his arm and her heart beating so fiercely she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, as Frederick's voice rang out clear and strong across the suddenly silent dining room. Lady Lydia Carstairs had positioned herself near the head of the table, her smile sharp with anticipation of whatever humiliation she believed the evening would bring, and Eleanor watched that smile freeze and then shatter as Frederick spoke of his admiration for Miss Ashworth's intelligence and character, his gratitude that she had consented to become his wife, his certainty that he was the most fortunate man in England to have won the regard of such a remarkable woman, and the gasps that rippled through the assembled guests were like music to Eleanor's ears after so many years of enduring their whispered cruelties. The dinner that followed was a blur of congratulations and stunned stares and questions that Eleanor answered, with a composure she had not known she possessed, and she felt Frederick's hand find hers beneath the table more than once, his fingers intertwining with hers in silent reassurance whenever she faltered, his steady presence anchoring her through the overwhelming tide of attention from people who had never before considered her worthy of notice. Lord Thomas raised his glass in a toast that made Eleanor laugh, and Frederick rolled his eyes with fond exasperation, declaring that he had never seen his friend so thoroughly and happily conquered, and that Miss Ashworth must possess some extraordinary power to have tamed the most elusive bachelor in England, and the warmth in his voice told Eleanor that she had gained not only a husband, but a true friend in Frederick's inner circle. Lady Harriet sat across the table glowing with a pride that Eleanor had never seen directed at herself before, and even Clara managed a genuine smile when their eyes met, the resentment of recent weeks finally giving way to acceptance that perhaps her sister's happiness did not diminish her own chances, but rather opened new possibilities for the entire Ashworth family. As the evening drew to a close and the carriages were called to convey the guests home through the lamplit streets of London, Frederick drew Eleanor aside to a quiet corner of the entrance hall and took both her hands in his. And when he looked down at her, his eyes held such tenderness that she felt tears prick at her own, and he said simply, "Thank you for trusting me, for believing that my love is real, and I promise you, Eleanor, that I will spend every day of our lives together proving that you made the right choice." And Eleanor rose on her toes and pressed a brief kiss to his cheek that scandalized the footman standing nearby and made Frederick's face break into a smile of such pure joy that Eleanor knew she would remember this moment forever. The weeks that followed the engagement announcement passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Eleanor breathless and occasionally overwhelmed, as the reality of becoming a duchess settled into her consciousness with all its attendant responsibilities and expectations, and she found herself surrounded by modistes and milliners and jewellers who arrived at the Ashworth townhouse in a steady stream, summoned by Frederick's insistence that his future wife should have everything she required for her new station in life, though Eleanor protested that she needed nothing beyond what she already possessed, and that such extravagance was unnecessary for a woman who had spent years making do with remade gowns and mended gloves. Frederick visited daily, sometimes twice, arriving with flowers or books or small tokens that he pressed into her hands with that quiet smile that still made her heart flutter despite the growing familiarity between them, and they spent hours in conversation that ranged from parliamentary politics to favorite childhood memories, to their shared dreams for the future they would build together, and Eleanor discovered that the more she learned about the man who would be her husband, the more deeply she fell in love with his kindness and his intelligence and his unwavering certainty that she was exactly the woman he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. The banns were read at St. George Church on 3 successive Sundays, and each time Eleanor sat in the pew with her mother and sister and heard the words announcing her impending marriage to Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, she felt a fresh wave of wonder that this was truly happening to her, the woman who had resigned herself to spinsterhood and invisibility, the woman society had mocked and dismissed, and she would glance across the aisle to find Frederick watching her with such warmth in his eyes that she had to look away before her emotions overwhelmed her in that sacred space. Lady Lydia Carstairs had retreated from society following the engagement announcement, her humiliation complete when the Duke of Somerton had chosen the very woman she had so publicly ridiculed, and Eleanor found that she could summon no satisfaction from her former tormentor's disgrace. Only a quiet relief that the cruelest voice in London would no longer poison the air around her with whispered insults and cutting remarks. Clara had undergone a transformation of her own in the weeks since the engagement, her initial jealousy gradually giving way to genuine sisterly affection as she witnessed Eleanor's happiness and recognized that Frederick's devotion to her sister was real and deep and unwavering, and the two sisters spent long evenings together discussing wedding preparations and laughing over memories of their childhood, and tentatively rebuilding the bond that had frayed under the strain of competition for a man who had only ever wanted one of them. Mrs. Agnes Pembroke called frequently to offer advice and encouragement, her kindly face beaming with satisfaction at the romance she had helped facilitate through that fateful tea invitation, and Lady Harriet walked through the house with a lightness in her step that Eleanor had not seen since before her father's death, her younger daughter still unmarried, but her elder daughter about to become a duchess, and all of London's cruelty could not diminish the joy that filled the Ashworth household as the wedding day approached with inexorable and wonderful speed. The morning of June 3rd, 1814, dawned clear and golden over London, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom for the last time, as Miss Ashworth, studying her reflection with eyes that still struggled to believe what they saw, for the woman gazing back at her wore a wedding gown of ivory silk that flowed over her curves like cream poured from a pitcher, and the pearls at her throat had belonged to Frederick's mother and his grandmother before her, and the orange blossoms woven through her dark hair filled the room with a fragrance that she knew she would associate with this day for the rest of her life. Lady Harriet wept openly as she helped Eleanor with her veil, her tears a mixture of joy and perhaps some lingering amazement that her elder daughter, the one she had quietly despaired of settling, would today become the Duchess of Somerton and mistress of one of the finest estates in England, and Clara stood beside them, holding Eleanor's bouquet of white roses and forget-me-nots, her earlier jealousy, transformed into genuine happiness, as she declared that Eleanor had never looked more beautiful, and that the Duke was the most fortunate man in all of England to be gaining such a bride. The carriage ride to St. George Church passed in a blur of nerves and anticipation, and Eleanor clutched her mother's hand as the streets of London rolled past the windows, the same streets she had travelled so many times feeling invisible and overlooked, and she marvelled at how completely her life had changed in the span of weeks, how the woman who had resigned herself to spinsterhood and solitude was now moments away from pledging her life to a man who had seen her true worth when all of society had been blind to it. The church was filled with guests who had come to witness the most talked-about wedding of the season, the union that had defied every expectation and silenced every cruel whisper, and Eleanor felt their eyes upon her as she walked down the aisle on trembling legs, but she saw only Frederick standing at the altar with Lord Thomas beside him, Frederick whose face lit with such unmistakable joy at the sight of her that Eleanor felt her nervousness dissolve into pure happiness. Frederick, who watched her approach with eyes that held no doubt and no reservation, only love and certainty and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. The ceremony itself was a sacred blur of ancient words and solemn vows, and when Frederick slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger and spoke the words that bound them together for life, his voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly with emotion, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she repeated her own vows and meant every syllable with her whole heart. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Frederick lifted her veil to kiss her for the first time as her husband, the congregation erupted in applause that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and Eleanor knew that she had found not only love, but home in the arms of the man who had chosen her when no one else would. The wedding breakfast at Somerton House was a grand affair that brought together the finest families of London society, all gathered to celebrate the union that had set tongues wagging for weeks, and Eleanor moved through the glittering rooms on Frederick's arm with a sense of wonder that she suspected would never fully fade, for every smile directed her way and every toast raised in her honor felt like a dream from which she might at any moment wake to find herself once again invisible and overlooked in the shadows of a ballroom. Frederick never left her side throughout the long hours of celebration, his hand finding hers beneath the table during the endless speeches, his eyes seeking hers across the room when duty briefly separated them. And Eleanor felt herself expanding into this new life like a flower opening to unexpected sunshine, her confidence growing with each passing hour as she realized that she belonged here not because of the ring on her finger or the title she now bore, but because the man she loved wanted her beside him and saw her as his equal in all things that mattered. Lord Thomas delivered a toast that made the assembled guests laugh, and Frederick shake his head with fond exasperation, speaking of his friend's transformation from confirmed bachelor to devoted husband in the span of mere weeks, and Eleanor caught the look that passed between the two men, the wordless communication of deep friendship that assured her Frederick would never be isolated from those who cared for him, even as he built a new life with his bride. Lady Harriet wept through most of the breakfast, her tears now entirely of joy, as she watched her elder daughter preside over a ducal table with grace and warmth that surprised no one who had ever truly known Eleanor's heart, and Clara sat beside her mother with a smile that held genuine happiness for her sister. The jealousy of recent weeks transformed into something approaching pride as she watched Eleanor shine in her rightful place. Mrs. Agnes Pembroke beamed from her seat among the honoured guests, her role in bringing the couple together acknowledged by Frederick in his own speech, and Eleanor made a mental note to ensure that the kindly widow would always have a place of honour in their home and their hearts. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, and the guests finally departed with wishes for happiness and health, Eleanor found herself alone with Frederick for the first time since they had spoken their vows, and he drew her into his arms in the quiet of the drawing-room, and held her as though she were the most precious thing in all the world, and she rested her head against his chest, and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and knew that she had found not just a husband, but a home, not just a title, but a true partnership, not just an escape from loneliness, but a love that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. And when Frederick tilted her chin up and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion that he had kept carefully contained during their courtship, Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervour, and felt the last lingering shadows of her old life dissolve into the golden light of this new beginning that stretched before them, full of promise and possibility and joy. The journey to Ravenscroft Park took 3 days by carriage, and Eleanor spent those days nestled against Frederick's side, watching the countryside transform from the crowded streets of London to rolling green hills dotted with sheep and ancient oak trees that had stood for centuries. And with each mile that passed, she felt the last vestiges of her old life falling away like a cloak she no longer needed, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation for the new chapter that awaited her at the estate that would now be her home. Frederick pointed out landmarks as they travelled, sharing stories of his childhood spent roaming these lands before duty and diplomacy had called him away, and Eleanor listened with rapt attention as he described the lake where he had learned to swim, the hill where he had flown his first kite, the village church where generations of Ravenscrofts had been christened and married and laid to rest, and she felt herself becoming part of a history far larger than her own small story, woven into the fabric of a family, and a place that would now claim her as its own. When the carriage finally crested the last hill and Ravenscroft Park came into view, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at the sight of the magnificent house rising from manicured gardens, its honey-coloured stone glowing warm in the afternoon sunlight, its countless windows catching and reflecting the sky like diamonds set in an ancient crown. And she understood for the first time the full weight of the life she had entered, and the responsibilities that would now be hers to bear alongside the man she loved. The household staff had assembled to greet their new mistress, a long line of faces both curious and welcoming, and Eleanor moved down the row with Frederick beside her, learning names and positions and committing each person to memory, determined to be worthy of their service and their respect, determined to make this great house feel like a home not just for herself and Frederick, but for everyone who dwelt within its walls. That night, as Eleanor stood at the window of the Duchess's chambers, looking out over moonlit gardens that stretched as far as she could see, Frederick came to stand behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they gazed at the land that was now theirs to steward and the future that stretched before them full of possibility. And Eleanor thought of the woman she had been just weeks ago, the woman who had hidden in shadows and expected nothing and hoped for even less. And she marvelled at how completely love had transformed not just her circumstances, but her very understanding of herself and what she deserved. And when Frederick turned her in his arms and kissed her with all the passion of a man who had found his heart's true home, Eleanor kissed him back, and knew with absolute certainty that she had been remade by love into someone stronger and braver and more whole than she had ever imagined possible, and that the life awaiting her here in this beautiful place with this extraordinary man would be everything she had never dared to dream, and more. The weeks that followed their arrival at Ravenscroft Park unfolded like pages from a book Eleanor had never dared to read, each day bringing new discoveries about the life she had entered and the man she had married, and she found herself settling into the rhythms of the great house with a naturalness that surprised her, as though some part of her had always been waiting for this place and this purpose, and Frederick watched her bloom with a quiet satisfaction that warmed her heart each time she caught his gaze across the breakfast table, or found him observing her as she consulted with the housekeeper about menus or discussed tenant concerns with the estate manager. The staff, initially uncertain how to receive a duchess who did not match their expectations of aristocratic hauteur, soon came to appreciate Eleanor's genuine interest in their lives and her practical approach to household matters, and she learned their names and their stories and their small concerns, and in return they offered her a loyalty that went beyond duty to something approaching affection. And Frederick told her one evening as they walked through the gardens that she had accomplished in weeks what many mistresses never achieved in years, a household that ran on respect rather than fear, and Eleanor had blushed and deflected the compliment, but held his words close to her heart like a precious gift. Letters arrived from London bearing news of society's continued astonishment at the match, and Lady Harriet wrote lengthy missives detailing the shifting attitudes of the ton, how those who had mocked Eleanor now claimed to have always seen her potential, how Lady Lydia Carstairs had retreated from society pleading a convenient illness after her humiliation at the ball, and Eleanor read these letters with a mixture of satisfaction and something approaching pity, for she understood now that the cruelty she had endured had sprung from the same well of insecurity and fear that had once poisoned her own heart, and she found she could not hate those who had wounded her when she herself had been so thoroughly healed. Clara wrote too, her letters at first stiff and formal, but gradually warming as the weeks passed, and Eleanor detected beneath her sister's careful words a genuine effort to understand and accept what had happened, and she wrote back with patience and love, assuring Clara that her time would come, that the right match would find her when she least expected it, and she meant every word, for she knew now that love could appear in the most unlikely moments and transform everything one believed about oneself and the world. The summer stretched before them, golden and unhurried, and Eleanor and Frederick rode out together each morning to survey the estate, and she learned the names of tenants and the boundaries of fields and the history written in every stone wall and ancient tree, and she felt herself becoming part of something larger than her own small story, woven into a tapestry of generations past and future. And when Frederick reached for her hand as they paused on a hilltop overlooking the valley that was now her home, Eleanor understood at last that she had not merely married a duke, but had found her place in the world, a place where she belonged completely and without reservation, a place called home.